It started as an ordinary summer morning in Pinewood Lane, the kind of neighborhood where the biggest drama was whether Janet from 104 overwatered her hydrangeas. I was sitting on our front porch, sipping iced tea, when Mrs. Connors from across the street stormed out of her house. "Another one's gone," she yelled, waving her arms like she was signaling for help. "Another what?" I called out, already regretting asking. "My flamingo," she shrieked. "That's the third one this week." For context, Mrs. Connors had a full-on display of pink plastic flamingos. They weren't exactly subtle, but she loved them. And now, apparently, someone was stealing them. By the end of the day, word had spread. Flamingos were disappearing left and right, and the neighborhood was in an uproar. "It's a crime spree," Mr. Donaldson from next door declared, clutching his garden rake like a weapon. "No lawn ornament is safe." "Who would steal flamingos?" I asked, glancing at my cousin Zoe, who had been munching popcorn throughout the entire ordeal. "Maybe they're building a giant flamingo army," Zoe said, deadpan. "That's ridiculous," I replied. But secretly, I couldn't help imagining it. The next morning, my mom joined the growing list of victims. "My flamingo," she gasped, staring at the empty patch of grass where her prized lawn ornament used to stand. I tried to console her. "Mom, it's just plastic." "It's not just plastic," she snapped. "It was limited edition. They don't even make the teal ones anymore." By then, it was clear this wasn't an isolated incident. The Flamingo Bandit, as the neighborhood kids were calling them, had struck again. That afternoon, Zoe and I decided to investigate. Armed with a notebook, a pair of binoculars, and an old flashlight, we declared ourselves the Flamingo Detectives. "So, what's the plan?" Zoe asked, scribbling suspects in the notebook's first page. "Simple," I said. "We figure out who's got the motive, the means, and the opportunity. And what if it's, like, aliens? Then we'll be famous," I replied, rolling my eyes. Our first stop was Mrs. Connors, who was still fuming about her missing flamingos. "I heard it's teenagers," she hissed, leaning in like she was sharing a state secret. "Always up to no good." "Thanks, we'll look into it," I said, dragging Zoe away before she could ask if flamingo theft qualified as a teen rebellion. Next, we questioned Mr. Donaldson, who had fortified his yard with solar-powered motion lights and a garden gnome army. "Got to protect the property," he said, holding up his rake. "Whoever's doing this isn't getting my gnome collection." Zoe whispered to me, "He looks like he's ready for a flamingo apocalypse." By the end of the day, we had a list of suspects that included bored teenagers, a mysterious flamingo enthusiast, and, of course, aliens, Zoe's suggestion. But none of it added up. As the sun set, I sighed, closing the notebook. "We're missing something." Zoe shrugged. "Maybe the flamingos just walked away." Very funny. Little did we know, the truth was even stranger. The next morning, I woke up to a full-blown neighborhood frenzy. Cars were crawling down the streets, neighbors were chatting in tight, suspicious circles, and someone had even posted a wanted flyer on the community board. Reward: $10 and a plate of cookies for any information on the Flamingo Bandit, it read, complete with a poorly drawn pink flamingo. $10. Zoe scoffed as she read over my shoulder. "They're really pulling out all the stops." "It's not about the money," I said. "It's about justice." "Right," Zoe replied, smirking. "And cookies?" Mom, meanwhile, had taken matters into her own hands. She'd set up a lawn chair in the front yard, a pair of binoculars hanging around her neck, and a cup of iced coffee in her hand. "What are you doing?" I asked, stepping outside. "Stakeout," she said, scanning the street. "If that thief thinks they can take another one of my decorations, they've got another thing coming." "Mom, you only had one flamingo." "Doesn't matter." Principle. Not wanting to be outdone, Zoe and I decided to expand our investigation. First, we created a map of the neighborhood, marking all the flamingo thefts with bright red XS. "So far, the thief's hitting random houses," I said, tracing the map with my finger. "No pattern. Or maybe," Zoe said, leaning closer, "they're leaving us a trail." I raised an eyebrow. "You've been watching too many detective shows." And yet, here we are, she replied, gesturing to the map. Our next move was to canvass the neighborhood for clues. At Mrs. Harris's house, we found a broken flamingo leg near her rose bushes. Do you think they struggled? Zoe asked dramatically. It's a plastic bird, I replied, rolling my eyes. At the Joneses, we noticed a trail of small, oddly spaced divots in the grass. Footprints? I wondered aloud. Too small, Zoe said, crouching down. Maybe paw prints? That doesn't make sense, I said, frowning. But then again, none of this did. As we walked back home, empty-handed, Zoe suddenly grabbed my arm. Wait, do you hear that? I stopped, listening carefully. There was a faint rustling sound coming from the bushes near the park. Probably just the wind, I said, though my heart was racing. Or the Flamingo Bandit, Zoe whispered, dragging me toward the noise. We crouched behind a tree, peeking through the leaves. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted movement. A flash of pink. Did you see that? Zoe hissed. I think so, I whispered back. Whatever it was, it darted deeper into the bushes, leaving behind a distinct trail of pink feathers. We didn't even think twice before following the trail. Pink feathers were scattered across the ground, leading deeper into the park. Zoe gripped her flashlight like a weapon, even though it was broad daylight. This is it, she whispered. We're finally going to catch the Flamingo Bandit. Or step into a pile of dog poop, I muttered, dodging a suspicious-looking patch of grass. The trail led us to the community garden, where the bushes were dense and the air smelled faintly of tomatoes and wet soil. Suddenly, a loud rustling sound came from the bushes ahead, and both of us froze. Did you see that? Zoe whispered, gripping my arm. No, but I heard it, I whispered back. Another rustle, this time closer. Then, out of nowhere, a small, furry creature darted out of the bushes, dragging something pink behind it. A squirrel? Zoe exclaimed, blinking in disbelief. And not just any squirrel. This one was huge, well, huge for squirrel, and had a shockingly fluffy tail. It paused for a moment to glare at us, as if annoyed we'd interrupted its grand escape. What is it carrying? I asked, squinting at the pink object. Part of a flamingo, Zoe gasped. Before we could react, the squirrel took off, its tiny legs moving like lightning. Don't let it get away, Zoe shouted, sprinting after it. What do you mean, don't let it? I started, but she was already gone. Groaning, I ran after her. The chase led us through the garden, past confused gardeners, and around the playground, where a group of kids pointed and cheered. Get it, girl, one of them shouted, waving a juice box. Thanks for the support, Zoe yelled back, clearly thriving on the attention. The squirrel was fast, but Zoe was determined. We followed it across the park and into a cluster of trees near the pond. It finally stopped at the base of a massive oak, where it darted up the trunk, still clutching its pink prize. Great, I panted, hands on my knees. Now what? You going to climb after it? Of course not, Zoe replied, wiping sweat from her brow. We wait. Squirrels have to come down eventually. That's your plan? Wait out a squirrel. Unless you've got a better one, she shot back. As we argued, I noticed something strange. Up in the branches of the oak tree, there was a small nest, or maybe a pile of twigs. And sticking out of it were several familiar pink shapes. Zoe, I said, nudging her. Look up. She followed my gaze and gasped. Is that? Flamingos, I confirmed. Well, parts of them, anyway. It looked like the squirrel had been dismantling the lawn ornaments and using the pieces to build some kind of fortress. This is insane, Zoe said, pulling out her phone to snap a picture. No one's going to believe this. We stayed there for another 10 minutes, watching as more squirrels appeared, each carrying bits of flamingos. They chattered excitedly as they added to the growing structure, which now looked like a cross between a nest and a tiny castle. Do you think they're planning some things? Zoe asked, her voice hushed. Like what? A squirrel uprising. Hey, don't underestimate them. Look at that teamwork. Eventually, we decided we'd seen enough. We need to tell someone, I said as we walked back home.
Who?
Animal control? The Flamingo Preservation Society. No, the neighborhood, I replied. If we explain what's happening, maybe people will stop thinking there's a criminal mastermind out there and start worrying about a squirrel takeover instead, Zoe muttered, but she didn't argue. By the time we got back to Pinewood Lane, Zoe and I had a plan. We would call an emergency neighborhood meeting to present our findings. After all, people deserve to know the truth. The Flamingo Bandit wasn't a person. It was a team of highly organized squirrels. Mom wasn't entirely on board at first. You want to tell the entire neighborhood that squirrels are stealing flamingos to build, what? A nest? It's more like a castle, Zoe corrected, scrolling through the photos she'd taken. Mom sighed, clearly torn between skepticism and resignation.
Fine.
But if this turns into another Bigfoot sighting situation, don't drag me into it. Word spread quickly, and by that evening, a small crowd had gathered in the community center. Mrs. Connors, clutching a tissue like she was at a memorial service, sat in the front row. Mr. Donaldson had brought his rake, for reasons unknown, and several kids from the block were buzzing with excitement. All right, everyone, settle down, Mom said, taking charge. My daughter and her cousin have some important information to share about the missing flamingos. The room went quiet, all eyes on us. Thank you, I began, trying to sound professional. We know everyone's been worried about the recent flamingo thefts. But after careful investigation, we've discovered the real culprit. Zoe stepped forward, holding up her phone. It's squirrels. Highly organized, possibly genius-level squirrels. The room erupted in murmurs. Squirrels? Mrs. Connors gasped. Are you sure? Positive, Zoe replied, flipping through her photos. Here's one of the squirrels running with a flamingo leg. And here's the nest, or castle, they're building in the big oak tree by the park. She passed her phone around, and people gasped as they looked at the evidence. It's like something out of a movie, Mr. Donaldson muttered, squinting at the screen. But why would squirrels steal flamingos? Someone in the back asked. Maybe they think the plastic is good for building, I suggested. Or maybe they just like the color pink. Or, Zoe added, her voice low and dramatic, they're preparing for something bigger. Bigger? Mrs. Connors repeated, clutching her pearls. Like what? Mr. Donaldson asked, gripping his rake tighter. Zoe shrugged. I don't know. A squirrel uprising? A lawn decoration monopoly? The possibilities are endless. Before the crowd could spiral into full-blown panic, Mom stepped in. All right, let's not get carried away. It's just squirrels. They're not plotting anything. But they took my limited edition flamingo. Mrs. Connors wailed. And mine, added another neighbor. And mine. Mom held up her hands. We'll figure out how to get your flamingos back. In the meantime, maybe avoid putting out more lawn decorations. Just until the squirrels move on. The meeting ended with a mix of relief and lingering suspicion. People shuffled out, some muttering about setting traps, while others joked about starting a squirrel watch. As Zoe and I walked home, I couldn't help feeling a little proud. We solved the mystery, I said. Yeah, Zoe agreed, grinning. But I still think there's more to it. Those squirrels were too organized. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the pink fortress in the oak tree. What were the squirrels doing with all those flamingos? And why did they seem so coordinated? Little did we know, the mystery wasn't over yet. The next morning, I woke up to Zoe tapping on my bedroom window. She looked way too excited for someone who had barely slept. Get up, she hissed. You're not going to believe this. I groaned, rubbing my eyes. What now? Did the squirrels steal a garden gnome? Worse, she said, dragging me out of bed. Come see for yourself. We sprinted to the park, where a small group of neighbors had already gathered around the oak tree. The flamingo fortress was bigger now, significantly bigger. It wasn't just a pile of pink plastic anymore. The squirrels had added twigs, leaves, and what looked suspiciously like Christmas lights. What in the world? I muttered, staring up at the tree. It's like a flamingo skyscraper, Zoe whispered. Mrs. Connors was there, too, clutching her missing flamingo leg. This is unnatural, she cried. What are they building? Maybe they were decorating, I offered weakly.
Zoe elbowed me. Don't joke.
This is serious. As we stood there, one of the squirrels appeared on a lower branch, chittering loudly. It seemed to be scolding us, like we were trespassing on its property. Another squirrel joined it, then another, until there were at least 6 of them, all glaring down at us. They're watching us, Zoe said, taking a step back. They're squirrels, I replied, trying to sound calm. That's what they do. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Zoe was right. Mr. Donaldson, still armed with his trusty rake, shook his head. We need to take that thing down. It's getting out of hand. And how do you plan to do that?
Zoe asked.
Climb up there and ask them nicely? I'll do what I have to, he muttered. Let's not start a war with the squirrels, I said quickly, stepping between him and the tree. They haven't hurt anyone.
Yet.
As the crowd dispersed, Zoe and I stayed behind, watching the squirrels scurry up and down the tree. This isn't normal, Zoe said, folding her arms. They're up to something. I can feel it. Zoe, they're animals. They don't plan things. Tell that to the Christmas lights, she shot back, pointing at the tangled string hanging from the branches. Later that day, we decided to do some reconnaissance. Armed with binoculars and a bag of trail mix, we returned to the park and set up camp near the oak tree. We'll figure out their schedule, Zoe said, taking a handful of peanuts. Watch their movements. Learn their patterns. You're acting like they're spies, I said, though I couldn't deny the idea was intriguing. Hours passed, and we watched as the squirrels worked tirelessly on their project. They dragged more flamingo parts, pieces of cardboard, and even a shiny hubcap into the tree. What are they doing with all this stuff? I wondered aloud. Building something big, Zoe replied. But why? Just as the sun began to set, something strange happened. The squirrels stopped working. They gathered on a lower branch, chattering loudly, almost like they were planning. Then, as if on cue, they all scurried off in different directions, leaving the tree eerily quiet. That was weird, I said, lowering the binoculars. Very weird, Zoe agreed. What do we do now? Wait and see, I said, my heart racing. Little did we know, the Flamingo Bandit's next move was going to be its boldest yet. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to chaos. Flamingos weren't just disappearing anymore. They were vanishing in broad daylight. Zoe burst into my room, waving her phone. They hit 4 houses this morning. 4. 4 flamingos? I asked, groggily sitting up. No, for entire yards. They took every flamingo, gnome, and even one of those spinning windmills. The squirrels are escalating. We decided to head straight to the scene of the latest heist, the Donaldson's yard. Mr. Donaldson, visibly shaken, stood by the empty patch of grass where his prized collection of gnomes used to be. They got all of them, he muttered, clutching his rake. Even the limited edition Viking gnome. Did you see anything? Zoe asked, whipping out her notebook. Just a blur, he replied. I was in the garage, and when I came out, they were gone. We surveyed the yard, looking for clues. Sure enough, a trail of tiny divots led straight to the park. They didn't even try to hide it this time, Zoe said, crouching down to examine the tracks. They're getting bolder, I agreed.
But why?
What's their endgame? World domination, Zoe muttered. Be serious? I am, she replied, pointing to the trail. Let's follow it. The trail led us back to the oak tree, but this time, it wasn't just a few flamingos in the branches. The tree looked like it had exploded with decorations. Flamingos dangled from the lower branches like ornaments, windmills spun lazily in the breeze, and the shiny hubcap was now the centerpiece of what could only be described as a throne. What is that? I whispered. It's a squirrel kingdom, Zoe said, her voice filled with awe. As we watched, the squirrels appeared, dragging yet another flamingo into the tree. They chattered excitedly, as if celebrating their latest conquest. This is insane, I said, snapping a picture with my phone. No one's going to believe this. Oh, they'll believe it, Zoe said, pulling out her binoculars. Because we're going to catch them in the act. We spent the rest of the afternoon observing the squirrels, documenting every move. They seemed to operate in shifts, with some collecting new items while others stayed behind to guard the tree. "They're more organized than the neighborhood watch," Zoe muttered. As the sun set, the squirrels once again gathered on the lower branches, chattering and gesturing like they were holding a meeting. What are they planning now? I wondered aloud. "Something big," Zoe replied. That night, we called another neighborhood meeting. This time, we came prepared with photos, videos, and even a sketch of the squirrel throne. "This is what we're dealing with," I said, pointing to the screen where a video of the squirrels played. "They're not just stealing flamingos, they're building something. Something massive." "What could squirrels possibly need with all this stuff?" Mrs. Connors asked, clutching her tissue. "Maybe it's a power play," Zoe suggested. "Like marking their territory. Or maybe they're just bored," I offered. The room erupted in theories, ranging from the practical, they're nesting, to the ridiculous, they're aliens in disguise. Finally, Mom stepped in. "All right, enough speculation. We need a plan to stop this before the squirrels take every decoration in the neighborhood. We could set traps," Mr. Donaldson suggested, gripping his rake. "Or we could just ask them to stop," Mrs. Connors said. Zoe rolled her eyes. "Yes, let's politely negotiate with the squirrels." In the end, we decided to set up a sting operation. The plan was simple: lure the squirrels with a fake flamingo, catch them in the act, and figure out what they were doing with all the decorations. "This is either going to be brilliant or a complete disaster," I said as we set up the trap. "Probably both," Zoe replied, grinning. The following morning, we put our plan into action. Zoe and I had borrowed one of Mrs. Connor's backup flamingos. It was bright pink, shiny, and practically screamed, "Come steal me." We placed it in the middle of our front yard, strategically positioning ourselves behind the bushes with binoculars and snacks. "This feels ridiculous," I muttered, taking a bite of a granola bar. "Ridiculous or genius?" Zoe replied, adjusting her binoculars. "We're about to solve the greatest mystery this neighborhood has ever seen." For hours, nothing happened. We saw a few regular squirrels scurry by, but none of them paid any attention to the flamingo. "I think they're onto us," I said, leaning back against the tree. "Patience," Zoe replied, her eyes scanning the yard. "They'll show up." And just as I was about to lose hope, they did. It started with one squirrel, the same big, fluffy-tailed one we'd seen leading the operation before. It cautiously approached the flamingo, sniffing the air like it knew something was off. "Look," I whispered, nudging Zoe. "I see it," she whispered back, grabbing her camera. The squirrel circled the flamingo a few times before letting out a sharp, chittering call. Within seconds, 3 more squirrels appeared, moving in formation like a tiny, furry SWAT team. "Are they coordinating?" I asked, watching in disbelief. "They're like a tiny army," Zoe whispered, snapping photos furiously. The squirrels worked quickly, lifting the flamingo off the ground and dragging it toward the park. We followed them at a safe distance, trying not to laugh at how determined they looked. "This is it," Zoe said, her voice filled with excitement. "We're going to catch them red-handed." The squirrels led us straight back to the oak tree, where the flamingo fortress had grown even more elaborate overnight. There were now multiple levels, complete with what looked like a balcony made of twigs. As we watched, the squirrels hoisted the flamingo up into the branches, adding it to their collection. "This is insane," I whispered, pulling out my phone to record. "It's art," Zoe replied, staring in awe. "Chaotic, slightly terrifying art." But then something unexpected happened. One of the squirrels noticed us. It froze, staring at us with its beady little eyes, and let out a loud, warning chirp. "Oh," Zoe muttered. Before we could react, the entire squirrel squad turned toward us, chittering angrily. "Are they mad?" I asked, taking a step back. "They look mad," Zoe replied, already retreating. Suddenly, the squirrels charged. "Run," I shouted, grabbing Zoe's arm. We sprinted back toward the house, dodging low-hanging branches and tripping over roots. The squirrels didn't stop until we were out of the park, and even then, they stood at the edge of the trees, glaring at us like tiny bouncers. Well, Zoe said, panting. That didn't go as planned. You think? I replied, hands on my knees. Back at home. We regrouped. They're too smart, I said, pacing the living room. We can't just follow them and expect them not to notice. Then we need a new plan, Zoe said, flipping through her notebook. Something bigger. Something squirrel-proof. Like what?
She grinned.
A stakeout. Tonight. That evening, as the neighborhood settled into its usual quiet, Zoe and I prepared for our most daring plan yet, a nighttime stakeout. We packed everything we thought we'd need: binoculars, snacks, flashlights, and, at Zoe's insistence, a water pistol just in case. This is ridiculous, I said as we snuck out of the house. We're about to spy on squirrels like they're international spies. They basically are, Zoe replied, adjusting her backpack. And we're going to expose them. We set up our base camp near the oak tree, hidden behind a cluster of bushes. The Flamingo fortress loomed above us, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. Do you think they're active at night? I whispered. Only one way to find out, Zoe replied, pulling out her binoculars. We sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the park. The rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of a cricket, and the faint hum of a streetlight in the distance. Hours passed, and I started to doze off. Just as I was about to tell Zoe that this was a waste of time, we heard it, a soft, rhythmic rustling coming from the branches above. Did you hear that? Zoe whispered, nudging me awake. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the tree. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, there it was, a squirrel, carrying what looked like a string of fairy lights.
What are they doing with that?
I muttered. Building something, Zoe whispered. Something big. As we watched, more squirrels emerged from the shadows, each carrying an item. One had a shiny spoon, another dragged a small wind chime, and a third was struggling with what looked like a Barbie doll head. This is unreal, I said, recording the scene with my phone. It's like they're decorating for a party, Zoe said, her eyes wide. We stayed quiet, watching as the squirrels worked tirelessly. They seemed to have a system. One group brought supplies, while another arranged them in the tree. I don't get it, I whispered. Why would squirrels need decorations? Maybe it's not about need, Zoe said. Maybe they just want to. Like art. Art? Think about it, she said. Humans build weird stuff all the time. Why can't squirrels? Just as I was starting to see her point, something unexpected happened. One of the squirrels paused, tilting its head as if it had sensed something. Then, in a flash, it darted down the tree and disappeared into the bushes. What's it doing? I whispered. I don't know, Zoe replied. But I think we're about to find out. Before we could react, the squirrel reappeared, with friends. They chittered loudly, their beady eyes fixed on our hiding spot. Oh, Zoe muttered. Do you think they know we're here? I asked, my voice barely audible. As if answering my question, one of the squirrels let out a sharp chirp, and suddenly, the whole group charged toward us.
Run,
Zoe shouted, grabbing the backpack. We bolted out of the park, the squirrels hot on our heels. It wasn't until we reached the safety of our front porch that they finally stopped, retreating back into the shadows. Well, I panted, collapsing onto the steps. That was terrifying. They're protecting something, Zoe said, catching her breath. Whatever they're building, it's important to them. Great, I muttered. We're dealing with territorial squirrels. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the fortress. What were they building? Why were they so determined to keep us away? One thing was clear. The Flamingo Bandit wasn't just a thief. It was a mastermind. After the terrifying encounter at the park, Zoe and I realized we needed a new approach. The squirrels were too organized, too territorial, and clearly one step ahead of us. We can't just keep running into their turf, Zoe said the next morning, pacing the living room. We need to bring them to us. Bring them to us? I asked, raising an eyebrow.
She grinned.
It's time to set a trap. But this time we're going big. The plan was simple, or at least Zoe claimed it was. We would create an irresistible bait pile in our backyard, a combination of shiny objects, colorful decorations, and, of course, a few flamingos borrowed with permission from the neighbors. It's got to be too good to resist, Zoe explained, sketching out the design. We're talking glitter, reflective surfaces, the works. Won't they just take the bait and run? I asked. Not if we rig it with a motion-activated camera, she replied. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. We raided the attic for old Christmas ornaments, dug out some leftover party decorations, and even threw in a tin can for good measure. This looks ridiculous, I said, staring at the pile of chaos we'd assembled in the yard. Exactly, Zoe replied, setting up the camera. No squirrel can resist this level of tackiness. By sunset, the trap was ready. We hid in the house, peering out the window like a pair of amateur spies. You think they'll show up? I asked, biting my lip. They'll show, Zoe said confidently. They can't help themselves. Sure enough, as the sky darkened, the first squirrel appeared. It hesitated at the edge of the yard, sniffing the air before cautiously approaching the pile. Here we go, Zoe whispered, grabbing her binoculars. Within minutes, more squirrels joined in, chittering excitedly as they examined the bait. They're going for it, I said, my heart racing. But instead of grabbing the objects and running, the squirrels did something unexpected. They started organizing. One squirrel grabbed a shiny ornament and chittered to the others, who formed a sort of chain, passing it down the line like a tiny assembly team. They're working together, Zoe muttered, her voice filled with awe. This is next-level coordination. I stared at the scene, unable to believe what I was seeing. It was like watching a construction crew, but with squirrels. Just as they were about to haul away one of the flamingos, the motion-activated camera clicked, flashing a burst of light. The squirrels froze, staring at the camera with wide eyes. For a moment, everything was silent. And then chaos erupted. The squirrels scattered, chittering loudly as they darted into the trees. One of them, clearly the leader, stopped to glare at the camera before disappearing into the shadows. Well, I said, exhaling, that was something. We got them on camera, Zoe said, grinning. Now we can prove it to everyone. We spent the next hour reviewing the footage. The video was blurry in parts, but it clearly showed the squirrels working as a team to dismantle the pile. This is going viral, Zoe said, already typing up a post for social media. We're going to be famous. Or laughed at, I muttered. As we uploaded the video, I couldn't shake the feeling that the squirrels weren't done with us. They'd been outsmarted once, but they were clever. Maybe too clever. What if they retaliate? I asked Zoe. She shrugged. Then we'll just have to outsmart them again. For the next 2 days, the neighborhood buzzed with excitement over the video. People couldn't believe the level of teamwork displayed by the squirrels. The footage racked up thousands of views online, and our backyard became a local attraction. Look, it's the famous squirrel trap, one kid exclaimed, pointing at the now empty bait pile. Zoe, basking in the newfound fame, started calling herself the Squirrel Whisperer. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd poked the bear, or, in this case, the nest. My suspicions were confirmed the next morning. As I stepped outside to grab the mail, I froze. Our front yard was a disaster. Flamingos, ornaments, and decorations were scattered everywhere, as if the squirrels had staged a protest. The mailbox was stuffed with twigs, and the wind chime from the porch was now dangling from a tree branch. They retaliated, I muttered, staring at the carnage. Zoe appeared behind me, clutching her coffee.
Whoa.
They went full guerrilla warfare. We spent the rest of the day cleaning up, but the squirrels weren't done. That evening, as we sat on the porch, we heard rustling in the bushes. Do you think they're watching us? I whispered. They're definitely watching, Zoe replied, narrowing her eyes. And I'm not about to back down. What are you going to do? Declare a neighborhood lockdown? She grinned.
No.
We're going to negotiate. Zoe's plan, as always, was ridiculous. Armed with a bag of peanuts and a megaphone borrowed from Mr. Donaldson, she marched to the edge of the park and called out, "Attention, squirrels. We come in peace. You've officially lost it, I muttered, hiding behind a tree. But, to my surprise, the squirrels actually responded. One by one, they emerged from the bushes, staring at Zoe with what could only be described as curiosity. Here's the deal, Zoe said, holding up the bag of peanuts. You stop stealing our lawn decorations, and we'll give you these. The squirrels chittered amongst themselves, as if weighing the offer. Finally, the leader, the big, fluffy-tailed one, stepped forward and tilted its head. I think it's working, Zoe whispered. The leader approached cautiously, sniffing the bag. Zoe placed it on the ground and took a step back. The squirrel grabbed a peanut, sniffed it again, and then scurried back to the group. What happens now? I asked. I think we just made a truce, Zoe said, grinning. Over the next few days, the squirrels seemed to keep their end of the bargain. The Flamingo fortress remained untouched, and no more decorations disappeared from the neighborhood. I can't believe that worked, I said as we watched the squirrels from a distance. Never underestimate the power of snacks, Zoe replied. As things returned to normal, Zoe and I couldn't help but feel a little proud. We'd solved the mystery, caught the Flamingo Bandit on camera, and even negotiated peace with the squirrels. Well, Zoe said one afternoon, sipping lemonade on the porch, what's next? Raccoons? Pigeons? I laughed. Let's hope the squirrels don't spread the word. What's the most creative way you've solved a problem? Would you have negotiated with the squirrels or gone full defense mode? Let me know in the comments.